Good morning to our members in Germany and Denmark, and thank you for tuning in. I hope you have a good cup of coffee wherever you are. I am at our studio in Copenhagen. I am joined by Torben Frank, who is an old friend of ours. Being an energy expert, he was with us as a speaker for our roundtable on energy transition. Torben now works for Energinet, the Danish authority for the gas and the electricity net. Torben is Chief Commercial Manager for the Energy Islands. And the Energy Islands are part of the Danish government's efforts to decarbonize the economy. Torben and I have agreed on a rough structure for today's chat. The first point on the agenda is Energy Islands. What is the plan? Number 2 is the business case for Energy Islands. And number 3 is the potential for power to X in a German-Danish context. You are welcome to ask questions using the chat function of Zoom. So that's it in terms of organization. Welcome again, Torben Frank.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. So just tell us about the plan for the Energy Islands.
So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk about the Energy Islands. If we start with a big picture of the Energy Islands, this is part of decarbonizing Europe. I think that the most plans today show that if we are going to go to net zero in Europe by 2050, then we need electricity, and we need a lot of electricity. And the most obvious source of this is offshore wind, in particular in the North Sea. And the Energy Islands is part of that infrastructure that enable offshore wind production on a big scale. So the Danish government, or the Danish parliament, in 2020 agreed to build 2 energy islands, one in the North Sea, which will connect offshore wind farms to the Danish and European grids, and then use the island of Bornholm as an energy island where offshore wind farms in the Baltic Sea will connect to Bornholm and then connect to Denmark, or to mainland Denmark, and to Germany. So the idea is to use these energy islands as hubs where we connect offshore wind production to Denmark, but also to Europe. So right now, the plan is that the island on Bornholm will connect to Germany. We have a cooperation with the German TSO 50 Hertz. And in the North Sea, we have a cooperation with the Belgian TSO Elia to connect the North Sea island to Belgium. A little about the size of this. Current plans is that the Bornholm Energy Island will connect 2 or more gigawatt of wind production. Obviously, just to a misunderstanding that I sometimes hear is that the wind turbines will not be on the energy island. They will be, of course, offshore in the sea, but connected to the energy island. So 2 or more gigawatt of wind on Bornholm, and then in the North Sea, the political agreement is to have a minimum of 3 gigawatts and up to 10 gigawatts of offshore wind connected to the island in the North Sea. Time plan wise, we know that Denmark has an ambition of reducing CO2 emissions by 70% by 2030. Well, the Energy Islands is not going to contribute to that target, because the earliest the islands will be ready is in the early 30s. So 2030, 2032 are the ambitions for the Energy Islands, but it will contribute to getting Denmark and Europe to net zero by 2050.
And what is the amount of capital invested in the islands, and who is investing?
That's a good question. The island itself, in reality, is a relatively small investment. So on Bornholm, of course, the island exists. So that's just using some land on Bornholm. The investments in the projects are mainly 2 things. One, of course, are the wind turbines, and that's That's the more than 50% of the project are building the wind turbines. And that will be invested and financed by the energy companies who today are investing in offshore wind farms. We all know both of course, the Danish companies, but also European and global energy companies are investing in wind farms. So that's a little bit more than half of the investment. The other main component are the transmission assets. Connecting the offshore wind farms, they are connected to the island, and then from the island we connect to mainland Denmark and other countries, and that's a relatively expensive investment. Mainly because when you move further offshore, you need to move to slightly different technologies than we know from being close to shore, and that's more expensive. So that's also why it makes sense to build a large grid to combine things and to build economies of scale in the interconnections.
I imagine it is a bit more tricky to build that island in the North Sea, since you're using Bornholm in the Baltic Sea.
Exactly. That's obvious, but it's still a relatively small investment. I think that estimates range from something between 6 and 11 billion Danish kroner for the island. If you're going to build 10 gigawatts of offshore wind, that alone will cost you more than 100 billion kroner. So the island itself is a relatively small part of the total investment.
How large will that island be?
That's also a good question. Right now, there is of course the project is mainly being developed by the Danish energy. The DA, the Danish Energy Administration. So, and they are running, the plan is to tender for the island next year. And the island will be owned by a private-public partnership. And the idea of the politicians in the political agreement for the island was to allow for innovation on the island. So one thing is that we connect the offshore wind farms to the island, but that opens up an opportunity for maybe we can have some other energy infrastructure on the island than just electricity. For instance, we could have power to X. Could you have a hydrogen electrolyzer on the island? Could you have other power to X facilities on the island? And that, of course, will then define what will be the size of the island. So I think that the size of this ranges from relatively small to something that's relatively large, if that's a way of if that's an answer. But it's
Would there be a role for foreign companies in the construction of the islands?
Obviously, first of all, there are several roles for international companies. One is in the island itself, that the ownership of the island, this public-private partnership, will be a tender, and this could be both Danish but it could also be international energy companies or investors wanting to be part of the green transition and wanting to be part of the infrastructure. So that's one role for international. The other thing is, of course, building the island. Building the island will require, in reality, global, at least European scale entrepreneurs to do this. And I know that some of the companies looking at this are building consortiums with international players. And then thirdly, the wind farms. We know that in Denmark, I think the last few offshore wind tenders have been won by not Danish companies. Vattenfall has won the Kriegers, for instance. So there's a lot of potential for international players to be part of this.
Mm-hmm. We already have the first questions here. Why is it necessary with these islands at all, compared to today where we also have offshore wind?
Yeah, the reason why we need the islands is as you move further offshore, as long as you are close to shore, it's relatively simple to connect the offshore, the wind farms to the Danish electricity grid or the European electricity. As soon as you move a little bit further offshore, you need to have direct current technologies. So you need to have relatively large infrastructure components to connect the wind farms to shore. So that's why it makes sense to combine this infrastructure in some hubs on the energy islands.
So I imagine that your guess would be that we will see more of these energy islands also in other parts of the world.
Yes, Belgium is currently planning an energy island. Offshore Belgium, the Dutch have for some years been thinking about how can they do this, and I think that they will also have a project coming. And we see a general tendency, interest in having these infrastructure hubs offshore. And I think that if we are going to build, if you look at the International Energy Agency, they talk about something between 200 and 300 gigawatts of offshore wind in the North Sea alone, and that will require several energy islands in the North Sea to make this possible.
Okay. So there is another question: where do I find more information about the tendering process?
If you go to the website of the Danish Energy Administration, the ens.dk, they will tell about this.
In English, that's Energistyrelsen.
Energistyrelsen, yes.
Yeah. I think I introduced you a bit wrongly as an authority because well, there is an Energistyrelsen, which is the authority, and Energinet is actually a company.
Yeah, we're what they call a TSO, a transmission systems operator. Mm-hmm. So we operate and the Danish transmission electricity grid and the Danish transmission gas grid.
Okay. So let's move to topic number 2, the business case for energy islands. Sub-points could be: what are the economics of the energy island, and could you tell us a bit more about the economies of scale that there are in wind energy, and about the intermittency factor, or base load, I think it is called, base load factor.
Yeah. So if we start about the economics of this, I think it's one of the topics that is being discussed and developed at the moment. Also, that the Energistyrelsen have had just completed a market dialogue in these past few months with interested parties in the island, and one of the things being discussed, of course, is the business model for the energy island. In the political agreement from 1st of September this year, it was agreed that the cost of transmission should be, to the extent possible, paid by the offshore wind. And the logic of that is that as we move further offshore, then of course, connecting offshore wind to the mainland grid will become a larger part of the total cost of an offshore wind project. And that somehow makes sense, because we see that the cost of offshore wind turbines is declining. So there is a room to enable offshore wind to move further offshore. Now, when you then move offshore, then we need to make sure that it would be inefficient to connect each individual offshore wind park to shore instead of just combining to the assets offshore. So let's say that you have two 1 gigawatt wind farms, then of course, yes, you could connect them with the converters and connect them to shore, but you can also combine it to a 2 gigawatt connection instead. So instead of having 2 cables, you have 1 cable, or you have instead of 2 converters, you have 1 converter. So there's some economies of scale in connecting more wind farms offshore. Another opportunity, of course, is that you talk about intermittency, that what will happen is that the cables if you have an offshore wind farm and you connect that to shore, then in reality, you only use the cable when the offshore wind farm is producing. Now, what we do is we connect the energy island to both Denmark and in the North Sea to Belgium. That means that when the wind farms are not producing, then we can use the cables to have cross-border trading. So we transport electricity from Denmark to Belgium if the price is higher in Belgium, or from Belgium to Denmark if the price is higher in Denmark. So we actually create a dual use of the electricity connection. That's why we call it a hybrid interconnected project. So that's a use. The other synergy that could be, if let's say that you could have a electrolyzer on the energy island, then of course that the electrolyzer will be supplied from the wind farms when the wind farms are producing. But when a electrolyzer is a baseload facility, so that has to run constantly. So when the wind farms are not producing, then we can supply the electrolyzer with the interconnectors, and thereby create an economies of scale in what we do.
Is it safe to assume that the intermittency problem gets smaller the further you move offshore? So more steady wind?
One thing is yes. I think that calling wind steady is still the wind is actually something is an act of God somehow. So wind is intermittent by nature. What happens is that when you move further offshore, then the productivity of the wind farms increase. In reality, it's always the number of hours where you have full load increases. Typically with wind farms, you measure what will be the number of full load hours that the utility degree of a wind turbine, and that increases when you move further offshore.
There is another question here by Torben Jensen. You said that the energy island will contribute to the long-term 2050 target, not short-term 2030. What are the most important measures to the green transition before 2030?
Well, the energy island, of course. Maybe something. No, I think that electrification is still the most important thing to do. So anything that can be electrified should be electrified. So if you haven't bought an electric car, then your next car should be an electric car. And if you haven't bought a heat pump, then the next thing you should buy is a heat pump.
It's a matter of producing that much energy. That much electricity.
Yes. The demand for electricity will grow very, very dramatically. In no matter what scenario. Of course, if you don't believe in that we go to net zero carbon, then that's one thing. But if you think that the world is moving to net zero, then there'll be a need for a lot of electricity.
Okay. When we're talking about baseload, you mentioned that Power-to-X.
Power-to-X will be baseload.
Comes into play, and the X stands for several energy carriers, and one of them is hydrogen.
Yeah, the first one is always hydrogen.
Yeah, the first one is hydrogen. But how do you see the business case for Power-to-X in the medium and long term? It's of course in its infancy.
I think that Power-to-X. First of all, I think the hierarchy will be very simple in reality, that everything that can run on electricity will run on electricity, because electricity will be the cheapest energy form. Then everything that cannot run on electricity will, if it can run on hydrogen, it will run on hydrogen, because hydrogen will become the second cheapest form of energy. And then there'll be processes, could be things like, of course, air transportation. It could be international global marine transportation that cannot run on hydrogen, which will then have to run on some kind of synthetic fuels. We know that if you have hydrogen, then you can produce ammonia, which the shipping industry could use. You can also produce biomethanol, which can be used by the shipping industry. So there'll be some other forms of liquid energy produced from hydrogen.
There are two more questions, one from Morten Jeppesen. Which roles do you see the offshore oil and gas infrastructure can play in connection with the North Sea energy island?
That's also a good question. Actually, I don't know. I don't know. I think it's an underexplored topic. So that it's obvious that there's a lot of offshore infrastructure in the North Sea, oil and gas infrastructure. Whether some of this can be reused, I think is thinkable, but I do not know yet whether this will be the case.
We're talking rigs, yeah.
No, we're talking gas pipelines.
Okay.
Gas pipelines, I would think is the main thing.
Yeah.
We know from onshore studies that gas grids to a large extent can be repurposed to hydrogen. But whether that's still the same as the case for offshore gas pipelines, I do not know.
Another one from Stefan Lindberg. Would you kindly take us through where you will find the production facilities for completing the components for the island? Would this be a shared between Germany and Denmark?
I think that the answer to that is I do not know. Some of it depends a little bit on how you build the islands. If on Bornholm, it's obvious that it has to be onshore, so the all the electricity transmission assets will be built on Bornholm. So there'll be buildings. Mm-hmm. So there'll be buildings on Bornholm containing the transmission assets. Mm-hmm. In the North Sea, it's a little bit more that there are more opportunities or more possibilities on the North Sea. It could either be that we build the transmission assets on the island, which means that it will have to be constructed on the island. Another opportunity is that could be possible that some of it could be built in a shipyard somewhere and then sailed offshore and then installed on a jacket or a monopile offshore nearby the energy island.
And there's a question by Henrik Adler Nielsen. How do you see where to get all the expected power to supply the increasing demand in the next 10 to 15 years when Germany now plans to both close down their nuclear and coal-fired power plants?
Yeah, I think that this just the
$1 million question.
Yeah, but I think for Germany, this is actually, I think Germany have put themselves in a pretty tight spot here. Mm-hmm. By first deciding to close the nuclear power plants, mm-hmm. In the wake of the Fukushima disaster, and now wanting to close the coal-fired power plants. I think actually it's positive that Germany have been, of course, slow. The original deadline was 38, and now it's moved forward to 2030 in Germany. It's going to be very, very difficult for Germany to phase out all the coal-fired power plants. In reality, this will require a lot of offshore wind, because the potential onshore in Germany is difficult. We all know the difficulties in Germany about building anything that can be seen by anybody in Germany is difficult.
Not in my backyard.
Not in my backyard. And of course, then that points to moving offshore. The problem with Germany, of course, is a lack of shoreline. So there's some studies about what is the offshore wind potential in the for the countries in Northern Europe, and Denmark has a larger potential for offshore wind than Germany. So there's, I think that for Germany it's important to find some friends with offshore wind potential and find a way of connecting this to the German grid. That's also one of the reasons why, of course, that we are working with 50 Hertz to build something on Bornholm.
Finding friends is a good point here. Yeah. And we obviously think that Germany should find itself friends in Denmark.
Yes.
And which brings us to the topic, the potential for power to X in a German-Danish context. And well, there are estimates that Germany will need to import 70 to 80% of its hydrogen in the medium future. How much of that could Denmark and the energy islands provide?
I think that the energy island itself will potentially provide some of it. I think it's important to understand that if we built 2 gigawatts on Bornholm and we built 10 gigawatts of offshore wind in the North Sea, that far exceeds any Danish electricity consumption. So that will open up for 2 possibilities. One is that we export electricity to Denmark, and then in Denmark we have electrolyzers, so we produce hydrogen in Denmark and then export this to Germany. It could also be possible that we'll export the electricity from the energy island to Germany, to the Netherlands, to Belgium, and then the electrolyzers are in Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. I think so whether it's electricity or hydrogen that we are contributing, I think is still something that we'll see evolve however this lands. There's actually a question here from Henrik saying, well, that 10 gigawatts is a drop in the ocean. And the point is, that's actually true. That and the concern is actually not that 10 gigawatts is a drop in the ocean. My concern is that, well, if we're going to have 200 gigawatts in the North Sea, then 10 gigawatts is only 5%. And if it takes us 10 years to do 5%, then maybe we are moving too slow. So the whole thing is that we need to find a way so we can accelerate the pace of this and make this go faster, and finding a way to accelerate this. And this is not easy because it requires not just Danish decisions, but as this has to connect, we cannot take all this production to Denmark, so we have to connect to other countries. And we all know that international cooperation takes time and is something that's a little bit slower to develop.
What we also need, I think, is pipelines for hydrogen. Germany has, there's this topic about Germany having been as industrialized as it is, needing lots of hydrogen, but you have to get the hydrogen to Germany, and that would be through pipelines, I assume.
Yes, I think so too. I think there's a study of this year actually where Energinet together with a number of other gas TSOs in Europe studied what is the potential for building a hydrogen backbone grid in Europe. And the findings were a little bit surprising, I think, but positive, which is that it is possible to by 2040 to build an EU-wide hydrogen backbone grid. And the main part of this are repurposed natural gas grid. So I think 70% more or less is a repurposed gas grid. And that also means that they can keep the cost of this relatively low by building the hydrogen grid. But there's a little bit of it's a chicken and the egg problem with this, because, well, it's difficult to invest in hydrogen infrastructure because before there is any hydrogen use. And how can you start using hydrogen if there's no infrastructure and there's no production? So somehow we need to find a way of getting the hydrogen ball rolling on a large scale.
So yeah, well, sounds difficult.
It'll be a major, but I think it will happen. But it's going to be something that will require a lot of cooperation between countries.
Yeah, sounds like it is very difficult. But we do know that there are talks on the way between Germany and Denmark on several levels in order to get this going.
Yes.
But I take it that Germany has also played a role, or the energy hunger of Germany has played a role in the thoughts and the plans for the energy islands.
Yes. That again, I think that Denmark, we would like to be to lead by example, and the energy island is a project to lead by example. That we know that I think that, last week when we signed the agreement with Belgium and with Germany, then the Belgian energy minister was telling us that, well, this is the Danish energy islands will not be the first, the Belgian will be the first. But this, I think how we can lead by example is by showing how do we make this a viable proposition. So it's not just something that should be paid by the taxpayers or by electricity consumers, but this is something that in reality makes offshore wind more accessible, makes it cheaper to move offshore. We have the biggest news, I think, last week was that in Denmark we have a tender for an offshore wind farm, the Thor wind farm. The tenders were in last week, and it ended with several bids asking for zero subsidy, and in fact paying the Danish state for the right to build an offshore wind farm. We've seen that offshore wind farms over the last 10 years have gone from requiring very substantial support to then in the past few years to zero support, and now all of a sudden you can get energy companies to pay for the right to build an offshore wind farm. And this is just showing to me that offshore wind is becoming cheaper and will become more valuable to the society.
So economies of scale are giving us this business case.
Yeah, and the wind turbines are getting very, very large. They're 300 meters tall, so large equipment.
So everything's difficult, but we are ending on a very positive note here.
Yes,
there is a business case.
There's a business case.
Wind energy will help us to decarbonize or go a long way to decarbonizing our economies.
Yes.
Well, this is a topic that we will be dealing with again and again. Of course, we'll probably see you again in one of our events. Thank you for being with us. Thank you to our listeners or viewers for being with us today. I'd like to announce our next meeting. We're moving away from hydrogen and wind power and over to happiness next time. This will be a Christmas special on the 21st of December. We will be talking to Chief Happiness Officer Maike Vandenboom, who lives in Stockholm. She's German, and so we're going to do this in German. And I invite you all to be with us on the 21st of December. Thank you very much. Have a good day.